Hello everyone, and welcome to DevOps-Exchange. The title of this talk is Orchestrating Gender Equality, which sounds like a serious topic, and it is. Though the topic is serious, this talk is hopefully more playful, and the subtitle gives a little more insight here as to the content. The eagle-eyed and more, or possibly less cultured among you, will recognize that this is, of course, an Always Sunny in Philadelphia reference. Can I get a show of hands as to who's actually seen Always Sunny? It's not great.
Sorry.
In the series, for any episodes entitled The Gang Solves, you can be guaranteed that through their own sociopathy, ignorance, self-interest, or intoxication, the gang will, of course, spectacularly fail to solve the problem they set out to solve. And that is exactly what you can be guaranteed of here this evening. Also, I should mention that as satire, people often get confused about that. I should probably introduce myself at this point. My name is Richard. I'm Head of Systems Engineering at Depop, and this was literally the most recent picture I could find. Before I move on with the talk, I do want to make a serious point. Having worked in the wider tech industry for some years now, I've worked with plenty of female software engineers, but in the specific subdomains of infrastructure, networks, and systems engineering, I've only ever worked with two. And interestingly, both of them previously identified as male. Within an already male-dominated industry, our subdomains stand out as particularly male. Answers to the questions of whether this is a supply issue or a demand issue, or due to the invisible, hairy hands of society and culture pushing us towards gender-normative roles, will not be found this evening. As a straight white male with no formal education in gender studies or any related fields, appearing among a panel of possibly straight, definitely white males, addressing a room of predominantly straight white males, I feel it would be wrong of me to stand up here and pontificate at length as an armchair sociologist. It would also be wrong of me not to attempt a statement, or at least an understatement, that as an industry, we need to get better at attracting, growing, and retaining engineers of other genders, races, and cultural backgrounds. And on to the extremely shaky premise of this evening's adventure. I'm sure you've heard in the past from more interesting and coherent talks than this one of Conways Law, which states that organizations that design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. Now, if we state that communication and the way in which we communicate is tied to our identity, and that gender plays a key role in identity, then the logical and slightly facetious conclusion of Conway's Law is that the systems that we build will take on aspects of our identity and therefore, to an extent, will be gendered. If you're still with me at this point, great. Now, if we as DevOps engineers wanted to fix the potential gender imbalance brewing in our own code bases, how might we go about this? As DevOps engineers, how do we go about anything? By which we mean an agile approach, MVP, or working code that we will definitely iterate upon at some point. As DevOps engineers, we probably want to include some leaky abstractions. If there's no visible seepage, it's not DevOps. In this case, we might need some towels. And of course, our tools of choice: Terraform, Docker, Python, and a wildcard. Great. A ridiculously powerful, unsupervised machine learning model put to use by an equally unqualified systems engineer. Okay, before we launch off into building something, we should first do some analysis to understand the scope of the problem. Firstly, we want to add some metrics so we can see what's going on. So here we have a Terraform code base. I have a main environment that defines a metrics container. Just check them in the right branch. So we have a metrics container here. This defines some variables. We have a list of objects here, and we pass them through to a Docker container module that's shared. Within this module here, we basically define a Docker container that will iterate over a count and produce 0 or more Docker containers with some flexibility on how you pass in things like environment variables and commands. Some of the new kind of Terraform 12 functionalities are demoed here. So let's get this up and running. So we should have now 3 Python containers and 3 Siege containers. If we have a quick look at the Python module, we define 3 containers, and we feed in as an output of the Python default container module into the Siege containers so that the host name is configured. And Siege is configured to hit Python twice per second. Okay. At this point, we should have an architecture resembling something like this. We have our traditional random Docker image pulled from the internet, purporting to be a monitoring stack. Below this, we have our Python service instances, each of which has a corresponding Siege container that should be hitting the Python container twice per second. Let's have a look at Grafana and see if we can find our metrics. Okay, so we have some metrics. You can see here from this metric here that we appear to be 100% male. So let's dive in and see what could be the cause of this. Here we go. So there's appears to be some implicit bias in a dictionary here. The sex is hard-coded to male. So let's iterate on this and improve things. So now we've gotten rid of the dicts. We've replaced it with a type here that is a subclass of the enum type with 3 possible values, male, female, or other. We have our config class down here. We have a JSON serializer that will serialize our class to a JSON. And the sex down here is configurable as an environment variable. So let's have a look and see what happens now. So we now appear to be 100% female, which may be a better scenario, depending on your point of view. But from a diversity perspective, it's still the same. So now we can actually configure the sex. Let's have a look at what we can do here. So now going back to our Python service over here. We have 4 containers running, or four Python containers and 4 Siege containers. We have this random shuffle resource, which is a new Terraform 12 thing, as a resource rather than the function. It's stateful. So as long as the input doesn't change, the output shouldn't change. We pass in the output of this resource here to the input of the Python container. We can see now we have pretty good diversity, quite evenly split. Doesn't appear to be particularly random. So we've solved the problem. Well done, everyone. So let's scale up this process. Let's add a new service to our stack. So crash. Excellent. I'll come back to that. So our container count here is 4. Let's increase that to 5. So in order to increase our container count by 1, we need to destroy everything and start again. This is an MVP. We can accept this and move on. We appear to have a cyclic dependency here. So let's try and debug this. So we have a cyclic dependency. I'm not 100% sure what the issue might be, but it might be due to the fact that in order to increase diversity and combat perceived discrimination, we've had to ourselves be discriminative. Though from a gender diversity perspective, at least, we're in a better situation than before, we've solved the problem, but it feels like a hollow victory. It feels overly simplistic, awkward, and forced. Let's circle back to the original problem. You might have noticed that the title of the talk was referring to gender identity, and the term used throughout the codebase was sex. The term sex in this context usually refers to biological and physiological attributes. Sex is something that is assigned, usually at birth. Gender, on the other hand, as defined in modern times, is a very different thing. Though related to sex, gender is far more about society, culture, sexuality, and ultimately identity. As such, it is far more complex and largely self-determined. So what if we try a different tack and broaden our horizons? What if, rather than implicit assumptions or explicit and central orchestration, we encourage our services to determine their own gender? With gender being so tied up with identity and people's jobs and careers often also being tied up with identity, what if we combine the two things to produce a broader and more three-dimensional definition of identity for our services? What if, to do this, we use OpenAI's GPT-2 generative NLP model and trained it on a corpus of generally recognized gender identity terms and DevOps job titles? So what are we doing here? We take a dataset of generally recognized gender identity terms, a dataset of DevOps-related job titles. We then stir them in a large GPU-powered pot for 1,000 iterations to produce a generative model, which we use to power our raw identity descriptions, and then feed the results of this into a second model to produce a percentage-based classification of whether the identity description is male or female. Using these models, I produced around 800 identities ready for use. Let's have a look. Without further ado, I want to introduce you to some of the new team. We have the Continuum Diagnostic Engineer. It's a 10x engineer from the future. The unfeminine Astral Communicator, which is kind of like an agile coach, I think. The average storming feminist, average only among the other storming feminists, I believe. The big natural male. The power sex black cis female. The cis babe admin retrospective tattoo glove fit pizza. The Dutch assertive engineer. The dirty cowboy. The cat sexual and the distinguished diplomatic woman. It's a natural leader. The cisgender elf. Edward transsexual. The exception-based file engineer. Sir Jeff side note. And of course, Puritan Brian data engineer. As you can see, a more diverse and three-dimensional set of identities surely you have never seen. I have another demo, but it's definitely going to crash. So let's move on. And so what did we learn? We learned that naive central orchestration of gender representation and equality appears to have come with side effects, at least when you use Terraform. I'm not aware of any HR departments actively using Terraform as a tool, but it might work for you as an MVP. We learned that gender and identity are complex concepts, and that measuring gender on a one-dimensional male-female scale is flawed, or at least my model was. We learned that systems engineers should not be trusted with powerful machine learning models. Whilst reviewing the model outputs, I noticed that a small minority of the generated identities appeared to harbor some kind of implicit bias. For instance, the term engineer was weighted towards a more male categorization. This might have been completely random, or it might not. I think this serves as a passable metaphor that even in the most open-minded and progressive environments constructed with the purest of intentions, implicit bias will always exist. To be human is to be biased, so therefore this is not a solvable problem. However, by making ourselves aware of our own biases, we can reduce the scope of any negative impact they might have. And finally, we learned that as an industry we can do better. If we only try, one day we can all be masters of karate and friendship. The end.